The sun was dipping below the tree line as Dylan Myers rolled his skateboard through the cracked sidewalks of Elk Ridge, Oregon. It was the final day of summer break in 2003, and the small town's familiar hush had begun to settle in. That golden silence came with the scent of pine sap and the faint scent of something burning far off. Dylan's worn Vans scraped the pavement with every push, the flick of his foot as natural as breathing. To anyone watching, he was just a teenage boy enjoying a final ride before school resumed. But Dylan was not just riding. He was stalling. He should have been home an hour ago. His mom had made chili and she always served it hot with thick slices of cornbread. But he had not gone straight home. He never did anymore. Something inside his chest had started twisting lately when he passed his front porch like it was warning him. The lights in the house were always off until his stepfather got home, and when he did, the place felt colder with him in it. So, Dylan kept skating. He carved around a pothole near the corner of Pines and Bell Avenue, glanced at the hollow windows of the abandoned florist shop, and looked up at the first blinking star in the sky. He had no phone, just his board, his backpack, and a pocket knife his older brother Aaron gave him a year ago. It had his initials carved into the wooden handle. DM. He stopped near the old wooden railing overlooking Grayson Lake. The water below was still almost like glass, with dark green trees mirrored on its surface. The only sound was the occasional thrum of a late summer cricket or a branch crackling under the weight of a squirrel. He dropped his board and leaned against the railing, closing his eyes. He wanted to breathe without the weight that followed him home every night. But someone had seen him. Across the lake, parked in the shade between two forgotten birch trees, sat a car. A dark blue sedan, one of those older models with tinted windows and a license plate half covered in dust. Dylan did not see it. He had not noticed the way it had slowed when it passed him on Bell Avenue earlier, or how it had circled the block twice. The engine was now off, but the car was not empty. At 8:12 p.m., a woman walking her dog near the lake trail said she saw a boy on a skateboard wearing a gray hoodie and jeans standing on the old footbridge near the water's edge. When asked later if he seemed distressed, she hesitated. She said he looked like he was waiting for someone. The boy smiled at the dog when it barked. That was the last known sighting of Dylan Myers. At 9:04 p.m., his mother Kelly stood on the front porch, arms folded tight against her chest. The chili had gone cold. She kept checking the street pacing between the porch steps and the driveway. Her husband Frank had not come home yet. He had said he was working late. Kelly tried not to call Aaron, who had moved out 2 months earlier after a bad fight with Frank. She did not want to worry him. At 9:23 p.m., she called the police. The next morning, Dylan's skateboard was found at the southern edge of Grayson Lake, balanced oddly against a moss-covered rock. His backpack sat nearby, still zipped with his algebra textbook and a small pouch of colored pencils inside. His shoes were missing. There were no drag marks, no scuffle, no blood. Nothing was disturbed and nothing was stolen. The ground was too dry to hold footprints. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape by 10:30 a.m. Search dogs were brought in and volunteers formed lines along the wooded trails. Divers combed the lake's surface and dredged the muddy bottom. Nothing was found, not even a sock. Theories began to spread like wildfire. Some said Dylan had drowned and sunk below the surface. Others said he had run away a troubled teen with a secret. But to those who knew him, that never made sense. Dylan was not the kind of kid to disappear without a word. He loved his art. He showed up to school. He had a quiet kindness about him that made even the teachers smile when he walked in late with charcoal smudges on his sleeves. And most of all, he was close to his mother. By the third day, national news outlets picked up the story. The quiet town of Elk Ridge was suddenly flooded with reporters and camera crews. Kelly appeared on the evening broadcast, her voice breaking as she held up a school photo of Dylan from the 8th grade. His face was slightly turned, like he was already looking toward something else. Authorities followed every lead. They questioned classmates, teachers, shop owners, and neighbors. Nothing useful surfaced. There was one troubling detail that gnawed at investigators. Security footage from the Shell gas station 2 blocks away had shown a boy matching Dylan's description at 7:45 p.m., walking alongside a man in a dark coat. The two seemed to argue. The boy tried to turn away, but the man reached out and grabbed his arm. The footage was never recovered. By the time police obtained a warrant, the tape had been taped over. The store's system recycled its feed every 48 hours, and no one had thought to copy it. That lead went cold. The man was never identified. 3 weeks after Dylan disappeared, the searches ended. Divers packed up. The volunteers stopped showing. The news vans left. Flyers began to peel from telephone poles. And slowly, Grayson Lake returned to silence. But Kelly did not. Every Sunday, she walked the path by the lake, stopping near the spot where Dylan's skateboard was found. She brought fresh flowers. She still packed an extra sandwich, just in case. What no one realized then, not even Kelly, was that the lake was not done talking. It was only waiting for winter. Elk Ridge had always been a place where people waved from their porches and borrowed sugar from each other without asking. It was a town that existed quietly beneath the radar, nestled between tired hills and long-forgotten logging trails. The news of Dylan's disappearance struck the community like a fault line, splitting routines and cracking open the illusion of safety. Within hours of the first police report, neighbors gathered with printed maps and handheld radios. Volunteers formed in the school gymnasium under fluorescent lights that flickered like they had something to say. Everyone remembered Dylan. He had drawn a mural on the library wall for the county fair. He had helped shovel snow from Mrs. Langley's driveway the previous winter. There was no room for the idea that he was just another runaway. The search covered more than just the lake and its surrounding trails. They canvassed the back alleys of town, checked beneath bridges and in crawl spaces behind abandoned buildings. The grocery store on Main Street posted a photo of Dylan on the register. The diner offered free coffee to anyone who joined the search efforts. People dropped casseroles off at Kelly's house and left flowers by the porch steps without ringing the bell. Despite their best efforts, though, each night fell heavier than the last. The search began to feel like trying to hold water in open hands. The forest that had always been a backdrop now felt like it had eyes. Rumors began to stir. Some said it was a stranger passing through. Others whispered about deeper things, family things. It was during one of the colder nights that a boy from Dylan's class came forward. His name was Micah, a quiet kid who rarely spoke unless someone asked him directly. He sat in the sheriff's office with a trembling hand and eyes that could not quite stay focused. He said he and Dylan had made a plan to run away. They were going to take the train that cut through the edge of town near Hollow Bend. The plan was never serious, just something they whispered about when life felt like too much. But a week before Dylan disappeared, they set a date. The idea was to meet by the old cannery after dark. Micah waited, but Dylan never came. Micah said he never told anyone because he thought it was a joke that got out of hand. The revelation raised more questions than answers. The train yard was searched again. Nothing new was found. Kelly was called in to look at Dylan's sketchbooks for any mention of the plan. She opened each one like a fragile memory. One of the pages held a crude drawing of a bridge over water marked with a tiny red X. It matched the old wooden bridge by the lake. Alongside the drawing were 3 words scribbled in fading ink. Do not trust. That discovery shifted the direction of the investigation. The words were vague, but the implication was not. Dylan may have known something. He may have been afraid of someone. Police returned to question family members and close friends again, this time with a different tone. During the second round of questioning, a neighbor named Mr. Whittle mentioned something odd. He had seen Dylan 2 nights before he vanished, sneaking through the backyard toward the woods. He thought Dylan was just being a teenager, but then he remembered the boy had something in his hands, a long metal object. When pressed, he said it looked like a crowbar. The detail seemed strange. Dylan was artistic, not the kind of boy to carry tools around. Investigators wondered if he had been trying to get into something, or maybe protect himself. The backyard trail led into the thickest part of the woods that bordered Grayson Lake. There were no buildings back there anymore, just remnants of logging shacks and the skeletal remains of an old ranger station. They sent dogs out again. Nothing came of it. Kelly started keeping the porch light on all night every night. She still made enough dinner for 2. At school, Dylan's desk remained empty but untouched. His classmates left notes in his locker. One girl taped a drawing of a skateboard with angel wings to his math textbook. For a time, the town held candlelight vigils and prayer circles. Then, life slowly edged forward like it always does. People returned to work. The casseroles stopped arriving. But Dylan's face never disappeared. It lingered in conversations at grocery store lines. It stared from the missing posters taped to dusty windows. Elk Ridge was no longer just a quiet town. It was a quiet town that had lost a boy. By the end of that fall, a shift had taken root. People became more guarded. Porch lights stayed on later. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone from the park. The town began to stretch under the weight of uncertainty. Police patrols increased, but there was no threat to follow. Just a hole where something used to be. At school, Micah withdrew. His parents transferred him out after winter break. Rumors followed him, unfair and relentless. Some blamed him for not speaking up sooner. Others thought he knew more than he was saying. No one could say for sure. Even Kelly stopped asking questions publicly. She started keeping a binder carefully organized with news clippings, police reports, and her own handwritten theories. Her grief turned quiet, but it never turned off. In the weeks that followed the initial search, the town's sense of identity began to change. Elk Ridge had always prided itself on its sense of community, but now there were unspoken fears under every interaction. People began locking their doors during the day. Strangers were met with suspicion. Local teens who used to skateboard around the lake were told to avoid the area. The bridge, where Dylan had last been seen, was left to decay. Moss overtook the railing. The wood rotted under winter rain. It became a silent monument to the moment everything changed. For a place that once felt like a safe pocket of the world, Elk Ridge had become a question no one could answer. 2 months after the search for Dylan had officially ended, Kelly found herself wandering into her son's room with a laundry basket she had no intention of using. His room remained untouched. Posters of punk bands hung crooked on the walls. Sketches curled at the edges, pinned near his bed, some half-finished with pencil smudges like ghosts. His favorite hoodie still hung on the closet door. It smelled faintly of pine and graphite. She stood there for a long time until her fingers moved toward the top shelf of the closet. Tucked behind an old lunchbox was something she had not seen before. It was a small leather notebook. The cover had scratches along the spine, and the initials DM were etched faintly in the corner. She opened it gently, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. Inside the notebook were pages of sketches, most of them unfamiliar. One page held a rough map of the woods near Grayson Lake. The drawing was jagged but clear, and marked near the center was a small X with the words Project Red House written beside it. The term meant nothing to her, but it looked important. Several other pages contained lists of what looked like supplies. Rope, flashlight, batteries. She flipped further until she found something wedged between 2 pages. It was a folded receipt from a hardware store in town. The date was 1 week before Dylan vanished. The name on the receipt was not Dylan's. It was Frank's. The list matched Dylan's notebook exactly. Rope, lock, duct tape. Kelly sat down on the edge of Dylan's bed. Her hands were cold. Her breath came short. She had never asked questions about what Frank did on weekends. He always said he was fixing things around the property or helping friends from his old construction crew. She had never seen the tools he claimed to use. She never followed him to check. Later that night, Kelly waited until Frank was asleep in the living room chair before slipping into the garage. The overhead light flickered once before settling into a dull glow. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard. Shelves lined the walls. She began opening drawers, not sure what she was looking for, until she found an old canvas bag beneath the workbench. Inside were zip ties, more duct tape, and a flashlight. She reached further and found a red folder. It was stuffed with papers, many of them old receipts and printed maps. One of them matched the sketch in Dylan's notebook. It was a satellite image of the woods. A red circle had been drawn around a small clearing near the south edge of the lake. She felt her knees weaken as she stared at the markings. She looked at the folder again. On the front, written in red marker, were the words, "Private, do not touch." Kelly did not sleep that night. She stayed at the kitchen table with Dylan's notebook and the folder side by side. She reread each page until her eyes blurred. She tried to connect the pieces, tried to remember anything Frank had said or done in the weeks leading up to Dylan's disappearance. There was a night, 2 days before Dylan vanished, when Frank had come home late, his clothes smelling like gasoline and damp earth. He had said the truck had gotten stuck in the trail out by the ridge. At the time, it had not seemed strange. Now, it felt like a puzzle piece that had never quite fit. Kelly closed the notebook and folder, placed them in a paper bag, and tucked it beneath the floorboard in her closet. She would decide what to do in the morning. The morning brought more questions than answers. Kelly confronted Frank over breakfast. She asked about the hardware receipt. He said it was for a project he had been working on with a friend from work. She asked about the maps. He shrugged and said he liked hunting trails and had been marking deer paths. He seemed calm, but Kelly noticed the way his eyes stayed on her hands, watching for what she might reveal. She asked if he had ever spoken to Dylan about the woods. Frank paused too long before answering. He said no, not really. Kelly did not believe him. Later that afternoon, she called Aaron. Aaron had not spoken to his stepfather since moving out. The last fight had ended with a broken door frame and a bruise under his left eye. When Kelly told him about the notebook and the receipt, there was a long silence. Then Aaron admitted something he had kept to himself. About a month before Dylan disappeared, he had seen him getting into a dark sedan near the bus stop. The car matched the one described in the missing footage from the gas station. Aaron had followed the car on foot for a few blocks but lost it near the woods. He had not told anyone because he had no proof. But now, hearing about the folder and the map, he felt a pit open in his chest. He asked Kelly if Frank owned a car like that. She said no, not to her knowledge, but she also had never looked too closely at what Frank kept at his friend's storage shed on the other side of town. Aaron came home that evening. He and Kelly sat in silence on the porch for a long time. The wind shifted and carried with it the faint smell of pine. Dylan's favorite season had always been fall. The colors made him want to draw everything. They remembered that together, and it made the silence hurt a little less. But there was something in the air now, something darker and more pressing than grief. It was suspicion wrapped in memory. They decided they would go to the storage shed the next day. If Frank had nothing to hide, it would be empty. If not, then maybe they were closer to the truth than they dared imagine. 11 years after Dylan's disappearance, winter arrived early in Elk Ridge. By late November, Grayson Lake had begun to freeze over its surface, slowly turning to pale blue ice beneath the skeletal shadows of trees. The air was colder than usual, sharp enough to sting the lungs. On a Saturday afternoon, 2 teenage boys skated out to the center of the lake, their laughter echoing against the quiet woods. One of them slipped near the edge of a patch of cracked ice. As he got up, he noticed something under the surface. At first, it looked like a branch or a log caught in the shallow depth. But when he leaned in closer, he saw wheels and faded red paint. It was a skateboard wedged into the frozen silt, clearly visible beneath the thinning ice. The boy called out to his friend. Together, they ran back to the edge and yelled for help. By evening, the sheriff had roped off the lake. The discovery brought media trucks and a new wave of curiosity. Kelly heard about it from a neighbor before the police arrived at her door. She already knew what they would say. The skateboard was Dylan's. The worn-out grip tape. The black Sharpie initials near the tail. She had memorized every detail long ago. They recovered it carefully, chipping around the ice to avoid damage. Beneath it, wedged between two stones, was a sealed plastic pouch. Inside were Polaroid photos. The images were grainy, but one thing was unmistakable. The boy in the photo was Dylan, maybe a year older than he had been when he vanished. He had a bruise under his eye and wore a shirt she had never seen before. He was in what looked like a small room with concrete walls and a single light hanging from the ceiling. One of the photos showed a steel pipe with a chain bolted to it. The photographs reignited the investigation. The town that had long since moved on now paused with unease. Kelly met with the new sheriff, a younger man named Clark, who had not been part of the original search. He promised to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. Forensic analysis confirmed the photos had not been altered. They were dated using the paper's chemical aging and estimated to have been taken within 2 years of Dylan's disappearance. The lake had preserved them unnaturally well. Clark interviewed former deputies and brought in specialists to review the wooded area again. This time, they started with the map found in Dylan's notebook. A search team followed the coordinates more precisely than before. They marked the distance from the footbridge to the indicated spot, accounting for the natural changes in the landscape over the past decade. At the south edge of the forest, near a low ridge behind a wall of overgrown thicket, they found a clearing. The soil was uneven, and something had once stood there. Old nails and rusted hinges littered the ground. A few beams, blackened at the edges, suggested fire damage. According to historical maps, there had been a ranger outpost in that area back in the 1960s. It had long been removed from county records, but the satellite image from Frank's folder showed the structure still standing as recently as 2002. Beneath the ashes, one of the officers noticed a seam in the earth. After careful digging, they discovered a metal hatch, rusted and partially sealed with concrete. The crew brought in a saw to cut it open. The air that escaped was stale and heavy. Inside was a square chamber lined with a stone. It was empty. No furniture, no clothing, just metal loops bolted into the walls and a single bare bulb socket overhead. Forensics found human hair wedged in one corner and traces of adhesive on the walls, possibly from posters or tape. It was enough to confirm the space had been used, enough to suggest someone had lived there for a time. Kelly visited the site alone. She stood in the cold, her eyes tracing the space as if it might speak. She whispered her son's name once and waited, but the silence gave nothing back. That same week, the sheriff's office received a call from a retired postal worker named Leonard Branson. He lived 2 counties over and had seen the news report about the photos on television. He said something about the photo had jogged his memory. In the spring of 2006, he had delivered a parcel to an address listed under the name Harold M. Foster. The house sat isolated along the East Ridge near the old mine road. He remembered it because the recipient had refused to sign and insisted on handling the box himself, which was unusual. Leonard said he glanced into the house and saw what looked like a boy peeking out from a hallway. The boy looked pale and nervous. Leonard thought about reporting it, but convinced himself it was nothing. After the broadcast, he could not shake the boy's face. He believed now it might have been Dylan. The address was checked, but the house had burned down in 2009. The fire was ruled accidental, the result of faulty wiring. The owner listed on the deed was indeed Harold M. Foster, a man with no prior criminal record. He had moved to Oregon in 2001 and died in a car crash in 2010. Clark dug deeper and found something buried in the old sheriff's logs. Foster had once applied to be a maintenance contractor for the school district in 2002. He had not passed the background check due to inconsistencies in his previous addresses. Nothing more had been pursued at the time. Clark requested the full file and cross-referenced names, finding a detail that sent a ripple through the department. One of the references Foster had listed in his application was Frank Marlin. Frank had signed as a professional reference and listed himself as a site supervisor for an unnamed project. Sheriff Clark stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath visible in the crisp December air. The discovery of the sealed chamber had not produced a body, but the evidence within was enough to reclassify the case. Dylan Myers was no longer considered missing. He was now the center of an active investigation involving unlawful confinement and suspected homicide. Clark had driven out with a new team of forensic technicians that morning, hoping to sweep the perimeter again. They had found a narrow trail partially obscured by fallen branches and erosion. It was not on any official map, but it stretched in a broken line toward the western hills. Clark marked it with tape and ordered the team to follow it carefully, cataloging every scrap of disturbed earth or faded footprint. The path led them through a dense patch of undergrowth and down a slope that twisted around the base of a shallow ridge. After half an hour, one of the officers spotted the remnants of a structure. It had once been a small cabin, its frame now caved in from age and weather. The roof was gone, the floorboards soft and fragmented, but beneath the decay, they found something buried. A steel cabinet half submerged in soil, rusted but intact. It took 2 men to pry it open. Inside were several containers sealed in plastic. One contained clothing that matched the era of Dylan's disappearance. Another held personal items, including a worn notebook with pencil sketches. One of the pages had a drawing of the cabin itself, and in the corner a single word written in shaky handwriting. Red House. Kelly was called in later that day to identify the notebook. She sat in the back of the patrol car, flipping through the pages with hands that barely stopped shaking. The drawings were unmistakably Dylan's. The lines had his touch, the shading like the ones she had framed years ago. She paused at a page that showed a door with a heavy lock. Underneath, Dylan had written a date. It was 5 months after he had disappeared. That detail altered everything. It meant he had still been alive at that point. Still drawing, still hoping. She closed the book carefully and whispered his name. The officers waited in respectful silence as she held the notebook to her chest. Back at the station, Clark assembled the team and laid out the updated timeline. Dylan had survived for months after his disappearance. The chamber had been used to hold him. The cabin was a secondary location likely used to store his belongings. The connection to Harold Foster now seemed more deliberate. They began reviewing his property transactions and employment history. Clark also reopened the files on Frank Marlin. The old interview transcripts revealed inconsistencies. Frank had stated he was working out of town the week Dylan disappeared, but new time card records showed he had clocked in locally at a warehouse job. The reference letter he provided for Foster was dated only 4 days before Dylan vanished. Aaron returned to Elk Ridge once again. He sat with Clark and listened to the updates in grim silence. When the photographs from the cabin were laid out in front of him, he reached for one and studied it closely. It was a drawing of 2 figures, one small standing near a window, the other taller positioned near the door. The second figure's face was smudged as if erased in haste. Aaron stared at the sketch longer than the others. Then he asked to take a drive. Clark approved the request, sending an officer with him. They drove out to the ridge, stopping near an old service road that had once led to logging trails. Aaron walked into the woods until he reached the clearing where the chamber had been found. He stood there in the snow, breathing heavily. Then he spoke quietly, saying he remembered this place. Aaron explained that Frank used to take him and Dylan camping out there during the summer. They had not come often, maybe once or twice, but he remembered a small fire pit and a hunting blind nearby. He said that Frank always seemed on edge during those trips, never sleeping much, and always carrying a radio that he claimed was for weather alerts. Aaron had once found a notebook in Frank's truck filled with strange sketches and measurements of tree lines. When he had asked about it, Frank had gotten angry and told him to leave it alone. Clark took detailed notes. He asked Aaron why he had never shared this before. Aaron looked down and said he had forgotten. Then he said maybe he had not wanted to remember. The next day, Clark issued a warrant for the storage unit registered under Frank's name in a neighboring county. Inside, they found boxes labeled with construction materials, but many were filled with notebooks, receipts, and Polaroids of other unidentified young boys. Some images showed wooded areas, others featured caged spaces. One photo was of the same chamber where Dylan's items had been found. Another showed the metal cabinet. Clark handed the material over to the state investigators. They now had reason to believe that what had happened to Dylan might be part of a broader pattern. They sent out notices to other jurisdictions for missing boys between the years of 1999 and 2006. The investigation was no longer confined to Elk Ridge. But for Kelly and Aaron, it was still deeply personal. Aaron stayed in Elk Ridge longer than he had planned. He spent his days at the sheriff's office reviewing files and walking stretches of forest he had not set foot in since his teenage years. The cold seemed to settle into his bones, but he welcomed the discomfort. It grounded him. Each morning he returned to the site near the collapsed cabin and stood in silence staring at the earth where the steel cabinet had been unearthed. He could still see Dylan's hand in those sketches. His brother had drawn with a purpose. Each line was a message. On the third morning, Aaron wandered a little further west into a section of forest that had not been mapped by the search team. He followed a line of trees until he reached a clearing where a makeshift wooden bench stood beside a cluster of rocks. He sat there, breathing slowly, and allowed a memory to rise. He remembered Dylan asking to camp there one summer. He had been about 12, full of curiosity and energy. Aaron had teased him for bringing his sketchbook, but Dylan had insisted on capturing the trees and sky. They had stayed one night building a fire and eating from cans. Frank had not joined them that time. He had dropped them off and said he would return in the morning. That memory had felt normal back then, but now Aaron replayed it with a growing sense of suspicion. What if Frank had used those absences for something else? What if he had already been using the area for things no one could see? Aaron stood up and scanned the trees. To his right, half buried in snow, was a faded plastic crate. He brushed away the powder and pried it open. Inside were rusted utensils, an old tarp, and a pair of boots small enough to fit a teenage boy. He recognized them. They had once belonged to Dylan. Back at the sheriff's office, Aaron placed the crate on Clark's desk. The sheriff carefully cataloged the items. The boots were a match to a pair listed on Dylan's missing persons report. Clark asked Aaron how he had found them, and Aaron told him about the memory. Clark nodded slowly and said that trauma had a way of hiding important details until the mind was ready. They reviewed the photos again, particularly the ones showing Dylan with the bruised face. Forensic experts had narrowed down the timeline based on Dylan's appearance and estimated the photo was taken roughly 8 months after he went missing. That information stunned Kelly. It meant her son had been alive almost a year longer than anyone had believed. She had carried the grief of his loss for over a decade, but now the grief had a different weight. It came with the knowledge that he had suffered while no one knew. The sheriff began cross-referencing phone records between Frank and Harold Foster from that period. They found several calls that pinged from a tower near the logging road trailhead. Frank had previously claimed to have no contact with Foster after their brief professional overlap. The phone records proved otherwise. Clark requested a court order to dig deeper into financial activity. One transaction stood out: a wire transfer from Frank to an unregistered account 2 weeks before Dylan vanished. The amount was large, uncharacteristic of someone working seasonal jobs. It raised new questions about motive. Investigators wondered if Frank had been paying Foster to keep Dylan hidden. Perhaps he believed Dylan knew something. Perhaps Dylan had discovered something he was never meant to find. Aaron began sleeping at the old family home again. Kelly refused to move out despite the memories embedded in every corner. She kept Dylan's room as it had always been. One night, while searching the attic for holiday decorations, Aaron found a taped cardboard box labeled with Dylan's name. Inside were VHS tapes recorded from an old camcorder they had used on family trips. Aaron spent hours watching them each grainy frame a window to a time before shadows took over. One tape caught his attention. It was dated 4 weeks before Dylan disappeared. The footage showed Dylan filming the backyard while narrating playfully. Then the camera turned toward the garage. He zoomed in and whispered something. Aaron played it back several times. Dylan had said he was going to find out what Frank kept in the barn. That barn had always been locked. No one had thought to check it during the initial investigation. Aaron told Clark the next morning. They returned to the barn with a forensic team. The lock had been replaced over the years, but the interior remained untouched. They removed sections of rotted floorboard and found a shallow pit beneath. In it were chains bolted to cement blocks and a rusted bucket. The pit smelled of mold and rust. There were carvings in the wood above it. Some looked like tally marks. Others resembled letters. The lighting was poor, but Clark recognized the word help etched faintly into one beam. They called in structural engineers and anthropologists to ensure the space was preserved correctly. It was clear now that Dylan had been kept there for a time before being moved. The barn was only 30 yards from the house. Kelly wept at the realization. The truth had been closer than anyone knew. The discovery beneath the barn shifted the investigation once again. Sheriff Clark brought in a profiler from the State Bureau to assess the likelihood of others being involved. The confined space, the crude restraints, and the nearby proximity to Dylan's bedroom suggested planning and familiarity with the property. Frank had lived there since before marrying Kelly. He had once mentioned that his uncle built the barn. Clark began reviewing old land permits and maintenance logs from the area and stumbled upon a name listed several times over the course of 2 decades. The name was George Tully, a former groundskeeper and handyman for a now-defunct summer camp located just 4 miles south of Elk Ridge. The camp had closed in the early 1990s after a fire destroyed one of its dormitories. Tully had remained in the area as a private contractor. His last known address was listed as a cabin at the edge of the old campgrounds. Clark and 2 deputies drove out to the property. The cabin was still standing, its frame warped from years of neglect. Clark knocked several times before entering. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Papers and old tools covered the counters. In the back room, they found a mattress on the floor and a metal chair positioned under a boarded-up window. On the wall hung a corkboard with pinned receipts notes and what looked like shift schedules. One receipt stood out. It was dated March 2004 and included a purchase of heavy-duty bolts and chain. The name listed at the bottom was Frank Marlin. Clark collected the materials and sent them for analysis. As they were leaving, a deputy pointed out a large journal wedged between 2 floorboards. Inside were entries that began in '99 and continued until 2005. The pages were filled with terse handwriting and vague references to watching someone. Back at the station, Clark read through the journal carefully. The writing was erratic and often disjointed. One entry described a boy who refused to eat and kept drawing pictures. Another mentioned a man who brought supplies and insisted the boy needed discipline. The entries never used names, but referred instead to initials. The boy was marked as D. The visitor was marked as M. The dates matched the timeline of Dylan's disappearance. Clark felt a wave of unease. The caretaker had documented a routine, one that included feeding, cleaning, and reporting back. Several entries ended with the phrase, "job complete," followed by a check mark. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before the skate park memorial was held in 2005. It read only one line. "No return visit. Left the board as told." Then silence. George Tully had died in 2006 from liver failure according to public health records. He had no family, listed no next of kin. His property had never been searched, and his name had not surfaced during the original investigation. Clark called in a forensic team to comb through the grounds. In a locked shed behind the cabin, they found boxes labeled by year. Inside were surveillance photos, maps, and notebooks. One photo showed Dylan at a younger age, walking with Aaron through a local trail. Another showed Dylan skateboarding alone outside the hardware store. These images were time-stamped and carefully organized. The attention to detail unnerved everyone. The caretaker had clearly monitored Dylan for months before the disappearance. It was unclear who had ordered this or how deep the surveillance had gone. Clark contacted federal agents for further assistance. News of the caretaker's journal and the surveillance photos reached Kelly through Clark that evening. She listened quietly as he explained what had been found. Her eyes did not blink as she held one of the photos in her hand. It was Dylan, smiling mid-step backpack slung over one shoulder. The image was dated just 4 days before he vanished. Kelly placed it on the table and asked one question. Why had no one come forward? Clark had no answer. The caretaker had lived in plain sight. He had worked at maintenance jobs, repaired fences, and cut trees for properties around Elk Ridge. No one had ever suspected him of anything beyond a quiet disposition. Some neighbors remembered him as polite. Others described him as invisible. His cabin was less than 15 minutes from where Dylan had last been seen. Aaron joined the investigation more formally, offering to help identify locations from the caretaker's maps. He recognized a few trails and helped mark areas that had changed over time. While cross-referencing one of the maps with county records, he found an annotation labeled with the letter K. It marked a narrow stretch of forest that ran parallel to a power line corridor. Clark and his team followed the trail. It led them to a shallow depression near a dry creek bed. There, buried under layers of rock and brush, they found another sealed box. Inside were personal items that belonged to Dylan, including a drawing of a window with bars and a note that read, "Almost home." The drawing had small initials in the corner. They were faded but still visible, DM. The note was dated March 2004, confirming he had been alive nearly a year after disappearing. The morning the story aired on the local news, everything changed. The segment ran for only 3 minutes, showing footage of the lake, the recovered skateboard, and blurry photographs of Dylan in captivity. Kelly had not expected it to feel like a reopening wound. Within hours, reporters began calling the house. People left letters on the porch, some with prayers, others with questions. But what shocked everyone most was what happened that afternoon. Frank Marlin was gone. He had left the house early, claiming he had errands in a neighboring town. He never returned. His phone went straight to voicemail. His truck was later found parked behind a closed rest stop 50 miles north of Elk Ridge. No note was found. Clark issued a statewide alert. The man at the center of their suspicions had vanished without a trace. Kelly sat in the kitchen holding the coffee mug she had been drinking from that morning. It had gone cold in her hands. The realization that Frank had fled confirmed what she had feared for years. Somewhere inside, she had always suspected he knew more than he admitted. She thought back to all the nights Dylan had avoided the house, all the excuses Frank had given about late work or broken down equipment. None of it added up now. Aaron stayed by her side, checking in with the sheriff's office every few hours. A deputy had been posted outside the house for protection. The atmosphere inside their home felt like waiting for a storm they could not see. 2 days later, a man named Dean Mercer came forward. He had worked with Frank years earlier on a construction site near Bend. He said he remembered Frank once showing him a photo of a boy in a dark room. At the time, he thought it was some kind of prank or art project. Frank had called it a test. Dean had not thought about it again until he saw the images on the news. He recognized the boy instantly. It was the same one from the photo Frank had shown him, down to the bruise under the left eye. Dean agreed to provide a formal statement. His account confirmed that Frank had possession of the images and had shared them casually without remorse or concern. Clark added the testimony to the expanding file. It was the first piece of direct evidence placing Frank in control of the materials found near the lake. That same week, state investigators received a tip from a warehouse owner in Springfield. He said a man matching Frank's description had rented a unit under the name M. Redhouse 6 months earlier. The name triggered alarms. It had been written in Dylan's notebook drawn near the location of the cabin. Clark and his team secured a warrant. When they arrived at the facility, the manager led them to a storage unit in the far corner of the property. The lock was intact. Inside, they found another steel cabinet and a series of boxes marked with color-coded labels. Each box contained personal effects photographs and documents connected to various missing boys across Oregon and Washington. In one folder, they found a detailed log of Dylan's confinement written in Frank's handwriting. The final entry read simple and cold. No longer responsive. Ended movement. Cleared sight. Kelly was not allowed to see the full contents of the file, but Clark shared with her the portions directly tied to Dylan. It was painful and horrifying, but it offered something she had not had before. It offered answers. Dylan had been held in stages. He was moved from the barn to the chamber, then monitored from a distance. The caretaker had been one piece of a larger structure with Frank directing most of the planning. The records showed coordination secrecy and a level of cruelty that chilled even the investigators. Frank had kept receipts. He had filed maps. He had logged days and reactions like someone tracking livestock. Clark stared at the page containing the word ended and promised Kelly they would find him. As the search widened, a few more voices emerged. A former bar owner remembered Frank meeting with a man who used burner phones and paid in cash. A former coworker admitted Frank had once joked about the woods having secrets better left buried. Every new detail painted a clearer picture. Frank had been running a system of disappearance. Dylan was not the first. But for reasons no one could yet explain, Dylan had been the only one to leave behind clues. His drawings, his notes, his skateboard in the lake. They were breadcrumbs that had led them all back to the beginning. Aaron sat with Kelly late one night and asked her if she had ever noticed how much Dylan wrote in his journals. She nodded and said that maybe he had always been trying to talk to someone. Someone who would finally listen. Sheriff Clark received a call from a retired volunteer firefighter named Glenn Morrison, who had seen the news and recognized the old cabin site featured in one of the images. Glenn said he had once helped extinguish a fire near that same location more than a decade earlier. He remembered the blaze had been small but suspicious, as the fire seemed to have started from beneath the structure, not within the walls. Clark invited Glenn to the station to review maps and photographs. As Glenn traced a route on the topographic map, he tapped a shaded rectangle just beyond the cabin's footprint. He said he remembered a metal door near the rear foundation that led underground. It had been sealed off at the time, but he always thought there had been something beneath the house that no one had ever fully explored. The next morning, Clark and a search crew returned to the site with a ground-penetrating radar team. They cleared the area and swept the zone where Glenn had indicated. The machine pinged over a rectangular mass 2 feet beneath the surface. Digging began slowly to preserve any evidence. Within hours, they uncovered a rusted hatch embedded into a concrete base. The hinges had been reinforced with metal rivets and a makeshift weld that covered the seam. Clark ordered a mobile cutting unit to open the hatch. When the door finally gave way, the team descended into a tight shaft leading to a small chamber. The air was stale and cold. The walls were concrete, and the space measured roughly 8 feet by 10. There was no furniture, only chains embedded into the far wall and an old mattress compressed into the corner. On the floor beneath the mattress, one of the officers found a folded flannel shirt. It was thin and frayed at the sleeves. Kelly later identified it as the same shirt Dylan had worn in a photo from 2004. The pattern was faded, but the stitching along the hem was unmistakable. It had been a gift from Aaron, sewn with initials as a joke. Alongside the shirt, wedged beneath a crack in the cement, they found a scrap of paper. It was brittle and stained, but still legible. In Dylan's handwriting were the words, "He made me dig." Clark held the paper with gloves and studied the script. The pressure in the writing suggested distress. It looked rushed and uneven. The phrase added a new dimension to the site. Investigators examined the cellar floor and found a patch of disturbed earth near the far corner. It took them 3 days to excavate carefully. They dug through layers of loose soil and clay until they struck something dense and unnatural. Beneath the surface lay a box made of wood and reinforced with metal corners. It had no markings but was heavy and sealed with wire. When the box was opened, the room fell silent. Inside were children's belongings, a pair of sneakers, a stack of drawings, a small toy car. Clark recognized one of the sketches as identical to the one found in the storage unit. It showed a barred window and a crescent moon. This box had been hidden intentionally buried in a space designed for isolation. The officers continued searching the surrounding soil but found no human remains. Forensics collected every item. The evidence now confirmed that Dylan had been kept here at least temporarily. It suggested he had not only survived but had been forced into labor or activity he did not understand. Aaron stood in the cellar that evening after the team had cleared. The walls felt close, almost suffocating. He reached out and touched the cold concrete where the chains had been mounted. He tried to imagine his brother sitting in that darkness, scratching out drawings and messages with whatever he could find. He pictured Dylan tracing hope into the walls while waiting for someone to notice. Aaron sat on the ledge and wept quietly, not just for the pain his brother had endured, but for the closeness of it all. These places had always been just beyond their childhood playgrounds, just past where the trails stopped. He wondered how many times they had unknowingly passed by signs. He felt the weight of guilt and memory settle deeper than before. That night, Clark received an anonymous voicemail on the department's tip line. The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. "You are not even close. You are still missing pieces." He forwarded the message to the federal task force now overseeing the broader investigation. The number had been routed through an internet calling service and could not be traced. Still, the timing was unsettling. Someone was watching. Someone knew more. Clark returned to the evidence board in his office and began reorganizing the timeline. There were still gaps. There were weeks where Dylan's location remained unknown. There were names and receipts that did not match. He stared at the word Red House Opapussus scrawled in the corner of one drawing. The meaning still eluded them, but it appeared again and again, like a beacon they could not yet translate. The winter snow began to soften by mid-February. The ice on Grayson Lake, once solid enough to hold the weight of 2 teenage boys, and a secret buried beneath, now thinned under the quiet press of morning sun. The lake had changed in the eyes of the town. No longer a peaceful expanse of water surrounded by evergreens and narrow docks, it had become a silent witness. It had kept what it knew frozen beneath the surface for more than a decade. Sheriff Clark returned to the lake with 2 forensic divers and a retired geologist who had assisted in cold case recoveries in similar terrain. The plan was to examine the lake bed near the spot where Dylan's skateboard had been found. The sonar equipment had revealed an unusual depression beneath the southern edge of the lake. It had gone uninvestigated during the earlier searches due to weather and budget constraints. Now, with federal support and a timeline closing in, Clark was determined to leave no question unanswered. The divers entered the water carefully, their movements slow and methodical. Visibility was low, and the temperature made the process grueling. After 40 minutes, the lead diver surfaced and waved for the equipment team to lower the retrieval winch. They had found another box. It was lodged under a shelf of stone and silt held in place by branches and decayed debris. The box was wooden, but reinforced with metal. Once brought to the surface, the team examined it under a heated canopy near the shore. The box was waterlogged, but sealed with wax at the seams. Inside, protected by layers of plastic, were journals and small containers. The handwriting matched the logs previously found in the Springfield storage unit. But these journals were older, dated between 2001 and 2003. Some entries were titled with the names of boys who had gone missing across Oregon in the early 2000s. One entry carried Dylan's initials. Another had a line under it drawn thick with red ink that read, "Not compliant, not reliable, not silent." The words struck Clark with a heavy weight. Dylan had not only survived, he had resisted. The most devastating find lay in the final journal. On the last page, pressed flat under moisture-stiffened paper, was a photograph. It showed Dylan crouched in what appeared to be a root cellar or crawl space, thin and pale but alert. His eyes stared at the camera. He held a piece of paper in his hands. When Clark had the image enhanced, the paper revealed a drawing. It was the lake sketched from memory with a single circle near its edge. That spot matched the coordinates where the box had been found. Dylan had hidden the location deliberately. He had left a trail that only patience could follow. The message was clear. He wanted someone to find what he had seen, what he had endured, what he had refused to forget. Clark handed the photo to Kelly in silence. She held it for a long time without speaking. Then she placed it face down on the table and whispered that she was proud of him. Aaron arrived later that afternoon. He and Kelly sat together at the edge of the lake, wrapped in blankets, watching the last of the forensic team pack their gear. Aaron stared at the water, the soft waves carrying bits of ice and reflection. He asked his mother if she believed Dylan knew they would eventually find the box. Kelly said she thought Dylan had known exactly what he was doing, that he had survived long enough to leave behind everything he could, that even when he realized he might not make it home, he had still chosen to act. Aaron nodded slowly. He said he remembered something Dylan used to say when they were young, that if you could not scream out loud, you had to scream through paper. He said Dylan had always been the quietest voice in the room, but maybe he had always been the one listening most, and maybe that had been his strength all along. Later that week, a memorial was held at the high school auditorium. The stage held photos of Dylan through the years. His sketchbooks were placed on display with his family's permission. Students, many of whom had never known him, attended with solemn respect. Clark stood before the crowd and spoke with measured sincerity. He said the case had changed the way they would train future officers. That Dylan's story had shown how deeply evil could hide in plain sight. That resilience did not always wear bold colors or raise its voice. Sometimes it sketched in silence and waited for someone to understand. Kelly spoke next. Her voice cracked but never faltered. She said her son had taught her what it meant to be brave. That the truth had always been buried beneath their feet, but he had never stopped trying to pull it into the light. She said the town should remember not what was taken, but what was left behind, because Dylan had not disappeared into nothing. He had left them everything he could. In the weeks that followed, Clark and the federal team closed the investigation into Dylan's case. Frank Marlin remained missing. Though warrants were active, there had been no credible sightings. Clark believed he was either dead or hiding in plain view under another name. The evidence left behind was enough to formally charge him in absentia with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of abuse. The case also led to the reopening of other cold cases across state lines. Tips flooded in. The patterns revealed in Dylan's journals helped connect previously unrelated disappearances. The town of Elk Ridge slowly began to change. The bridge near Grayson Lake was rebuilt. A plaque bearing Dylan's name was placed at the trailhead where his drawings had first been discovered. His artwork was printed in a collection titled Lines from Silence, distributed free to schools and libraries across the region. His story became not just a tragedy, but a lesson, a warning, and a testament. Years later, Aaron stood by the lake with his own son. The boy asked about the old path that led behind the trees. Aaron said it used to be a place people feared, but now it was just a trail like any other. His son asked why there was a stone with a name carved into it. Aaron said it was for someone who had lived here long ago, someone who had disappeared but never stopped speaking. The boy nodded and looked across the water. The sun was setting and the lake was calm. Aaron placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He said, "Sometimes the quietest voices tell the most powerful stories." He said Dylan had taught him that. He said courage is not about loudness or size. Sometimes it is just about refusing to let your story end in silence. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more true mystery narratives. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts help keep these stories alive.